And let me tell you, it's rated if you ever get into a nuclear survival, whatever. They have different ones. You can get rid of whatever you want. Arsenic. Why would there be arsenic? I don't know. They're selling it that way.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to our final episode on the Propaganda Loves You Book Club with our journey with the dawn of everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. This will be our final book club episode of season 1 for our podcast. We'll pick up with the books in season 2. But to start today's episode, I thought we could just watch this interview on Democracy Now! That David Wengrow gave in 2021. It covers a lot of important topics that we've discussed over this series with this book, and it might just give us some good jumping off points to consider to start our conversation as we reflect on the final 2 chapters. Also, just a point about the interview, kind of weirdly, you'll see at the end of the interview, David Wengrow clearly makes a decision to keep talking after he's getting cues that they're about to run out of time. And someone in the comments on the YouTube video poignantly pointed out that it's like an example of a critique of time structures, and I don't know, just thought as a formulaic moment, it's kind of interesting that he made that choice. And I don't know if you guys have anything you want to say about that when it happens, but just something I noticed. It's kind of funny and interesting. So let me pull this tab up and share this interview. Also, like the Democracy Now! Kind of comes full circle for us because I bring it up all the time in our main episodes, but they cover art and literature and academia and all kinds of stuff. So really good program, Democracy Now! Here we go. Let me know if you can't hear once I hit play.
The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn now to a groundbreaking new book. It's titled The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. It's written by the late anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow. The book examines how Indigenous cultures contributed greatly to what we've come to understand as so-called Western ideas of democracy and equality. But these contributions have been erased from history. After years of research, the 2 men completed the book in the summer of 2020, just weeks before David Graeber died unexpectedly at the age of 59 on vacation in Venice, Italy. Graeber was a highly influential anthropologist, a veteran of the international anti-capitalist movement that pushed for a different vision of globalization. His book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, made the case for sweeping debt cancellation. He also helped organize the Occupy Wall Street protests. September 17, 2011 was credited with helping to coin the phrase, "We are the 99%. In both his academic and activist work, David Graeber looked at ways to radically recreate society. This is David Graeber speaking on Democracy Now! Just 2 days after Occupy began.
So I ended up helping to facilitate a meeting which was at least 2,000 people. It was mostly young people, and most of them were people who'd gone through the educational system, who were deeply in debt, and who found it completely impossible to get jobs. I mean, these people really feel very strongly that they did the right thing. They did exactly what they were supposed to. The system has completely failed them, and they're not going to be saved by the people in charge. You're just going to if there's going to be any kind of society worth living in, we're going to have to create it ourselves.
That was the late David Graeber in 2011. We're joined now by his dear friend and co-author, David Wengrow. The 2 co-wrote The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. David Wengrow is joining us from London, where he's a professor of comparative archaeology at University College London. David, thanks so much for joining us. Our condolences on the death of David, just as you finished this book. David lived just down the street from Democracy Now! Studios and the ILG houses, the International Lady Garment Workers Housing Complex. That's just about a block from here, which so much shaped him. Can you talk about, well, just start with the title, The Dawn of Everything, and this new narrative that you both want to bring to the world?
Well, we really started exchanging ideas around the time that you were describing, the time of the Occupy movement. So around 2011, we exchanged books. David gave me the Debt book that you mentioned there, Amy. I gave him a book I'd written on ancient civilizations, and we started swapping ideas. We were interested in how our fields, so I'm an archaeologist, as you mentioned, David was an anthropologist, how we could contribute to debates on social inequality, which had really been escalating since the financial crash. Initially, we planned to write something quite short, really a sort of pamphlet, just to introduce readers to major discoveries from our fields that we felt hadn't really escaped out of the academy into wider consciousness. Firstly, this very conventional idea that before human beings invented agriculture, we lived almost exclusively in tiny egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers. It's not true. It's actually wildly inaccurate. There simply was no such period of prolonged political innocence. And secondly, the equally conventional and entrenched idea that our species became trapped in inequality through the invention of agriculture and then later cities. That's not true either. Actually, what the broad sweep of history shows is that living in large-scale, densely populated, technologically sophisticated societies really doesn't require people to simply give up social freedoms in the way that we're often told it does. As you can probably gather by now, this was already getting beyond a short pamphlet.
And David, one of the critical points that your book makes is that the encounter between indigenous intellectuals and early European colonists was very important to what we now refer to as the Enlightenment, ideas of democracy and of inequality. And one of the central figures you name is Kondiaronk, a late 17th century indigenous intellectual. So could you explain who he was and what his example illustrates about this broader history of the encounter between European colonists and indigenous peoples?
Yes. Well, it goes back to the first question, really. We realized there was something fundamentally strange about the fact that human history is conventionally framed in this way, about a question about the origins of inequality. Where does the question come from? I mean, it already assumes that there's something else, an age of equals or an age of freedom. And tracing it back to its origins, they really go back to an essay competition. In 1753, a French academy poses that question. What is the origin of social inequality? And reflecting on this, we realized this is strange. We're talking about France before the revolution, one of the most hierarchical societies on earth. Why do people already assume that things were once different? And following that line of inquiry led us, as you say, to the Americas and this encounter between European colonists and indigenous societies, particularly around the region of the Great Lakes of what's now Canada. And Kondiaronk, I mean, it was in that area that Europeans first encountered entire societies built on principles of social freedom that were still completely alien to European civilizations at the time. And Kondiaronk was very much a product of that social milieu. He was a leading figure in Wendat society at the time. He was one of the signatories in 1701 of the Great Peace of Montreal. Apart from being a warrior and a diplomat, he was clearly regarded by almost everyone who met him, Europeans and indigenous people, as simply one of the most intelligent people they'd ever met, a great thinker, a great orator. And he was routinely invited to the table of the then French governor of that part of the colonies to engage in debates with Europeans on topics that ranged from Christianity to marriage customs, the role of money, and the whole idea of political freedoms. And many of these conversations were recorded. Kandiaronk launches a truly stinging critique of European behavior. There's a lot about women's freedoms. There's a lot about the obsession with wealth and money as forms of power. There are many observations on poverty and the kind of endemic homelessness that was apparent already then in European towns, colonial towns included. And there's a lot of criticism of the way that Europeans are constantly, on the one hand, competing with each other, but also deferring to each other on the basis of rank and status, which seems to have been a principle that was alien and absent from Iroquoian-speaking societies at the time. So if a Wendat chief wanted to engage people in some kind of collective project, there was no real way to command or coerce, so it was all really predicated on persuasion. And it was widely observed by Jesuit missionaries and others at the time that people would sit in the village plaza for long hours each day, debating and trying to convince each other and reach consensus on the issues of the time. And it's actually not contested that Europe, in the Age of Enlightenment, adopted important cultural habits from the Americas, smoking tobacco from pipes, drinking caffeinated beverages. But for some reason, it never seems to occur to historians to ask if we also borrowed concepts and ideas. And in the book, we try to show that that's exactly what happened. And Kandiaronk is really a product of that culture, which influenced Europe in quite profound ways.
And also, I mean, one of the things that's very striking about the book is precisely what you say here, that, you know, there was from Kandiaronk and presumably others too, these critiques of European society at the time. Could you explain why you think these critiques have been all but entirely erased from the records, from historical records?
It's a very interesting question because from time to time, over the last few decades, historians, some of them, like the historian George Suey, who is in fact himself of the Huron-Wendat nation with a PhD in history, have drawn attention to these sources, but for reasons that I can't really explain, that really reflect, I think, very poorly on our institutions and on the academy. They have been marginalized, and one thing we try to do in our book is really shine a light on that existing scholarship.
I'd like to go back to 2018 when David Graeber talked about the dawn of everything. It was during a teach-out outside your school, the University College London.
We started saying, well, reading the inequality question, if we just move that aside, what is the real question isn't where did the inequality come from or where did the hierarchy come from? It's like, how did we get stuck in one mode? Because it's very different having a police force. You're going to be in the police force this year, but next year you will, and next year after that you will, and you know, so they're not good. People aren't going to behave the same in a hierarchy. If the hierarchy is going to get down for half the year, everybody has to deal with each other, right? As equals.
So that's the late David Graeber. David Wengrow, you're sitting right next to him outside your school. And so if you can explain the current debates about both democracy and equality and how they are really explained differently in the dawn of everything in this new history of humanity.
Well, it's interesting and a bit painful to listen to that clip for many reasons, one of which is that we're going to be on strike again in a few weeks' time over exactly the same issue. What David's describing there is one of the major things that came out of our research, which is that human beings, for most of the history of our species, has simply been a much more playful and experimental species than we tend to give ourselves credit for, including a propensity to simply invent and experiment with different forms of political arrangements. Once you realize this is the case, the question itself changes. We start thinking differently about the big questions of human history. If it's not about the origins of inequality, so if we do away with this false notion that there was once this society of equals, what is it then about? And what David's talking about in that clip is really the other question that then comes into view, which is, how did we get stuck? in a situation where these days we find it almost impossible to even imagine, let alone put into effect, other forms of social arrangements. And how stuck are we really in that respect? And I think the first step towards answering that question is precisely to examine the big story that we tell about the history of our species and about human capacities in general. So what we're trying to do in the book is really blow away the cobwebs of all these outdated theories and basically myths which persuade us that the kinds of inequality we have today are in fact an inevitable result of social evolution. And once you take those things away, what you're left with is really people making everyday decisions. And that in itself seems to us an important step in getting unstuck.
And talk about the argument you make around war and competition, that it is not evolutionarily rooted in human beings. It's not inevitable. Talk about this different view of history when it comes to war.
Well, when you look directly at the evidence, and we do have pretty good evidence, direct evidence these days for things like rates of violence and interpersonal conflict and injuries in the archaeological record, what you see, the way I would put it is that, yes, warfare and violence can be traced very, very far back in the history of our species, but they're no more inevitable in that body of evidence than periods of peace. Periods of violence and war come and they go. So one can't say that we're innately warlike and competitive any more or less than you can say we are innately altruistic and cooperative. The question which really emerges from the book is why it is that at certain points in history, violence, including warfare, has a more profound and durable effect than at others. In other words, why passing acts of violence, which are obviously always traumatic, but they don't always become structural. They don't always become embedded in the fabric of homes and family life, some of the other things you've touched on already in your show today. And that became a real focus of the book and a focus of trying to understand how it is that our societies have got to the stage where we do feel trapped and stuck. And simply by diagnosing the problem better, we feel that that in itself is important in reflecting on how one can then untangle oneself from those kinds of violence.
Could you explain, David, also from David Graeber's clip that we just played, how this conception of war and violence also has something to do with the fact of hierarchies being fluid in the way that your book shows and that David spoke about, that people who were occupied powerful positions did not occupy them in perpetuity, meaning not even in the same year, that there was a constant shift between those who were in power and those who were not.
This is an excellent example of what I was talking about in the sense of the experimental nature of human politics. When we think about hunter-gatherer societies, we tend to think of perhaps one or two basic forms of egalitarian society. Actually, what we found is that there's really a large literature on societies that some of them practiced agriculture, some didn't, that actually used to flip or alternate their social systems on a seasonal basis. One of the examples in the book, which David was referring to there, were the Plains nations of North America, which at a certain time of year, it was the time of year when the bison, the buffalo came through on their seasonal migrations, would form into a kind of society that in some respects resembles what we today would call a state. There was a police force, there were squads of soldiers who had full coercive powers. If anyone endangered the success of the hunt, they could be whipped, they could be imprisoned, they could even be killed. But the point about this, well, there's 2 points. First of all, is that the individuals who occupied those roles, those coercive roles, rotated on an annual or biennial basis. So you could actually be confronting the person who you've whipped, imprisoned, punished the next year, but from the other end of the process. And the second is that these societies, with their coercive institutions, didn't last beyond the period of the hunting season and the Sundance rituals which followed. And actually, for the rest of the year, these plain societies would split off into demographically smaller groups, which had entirely different moral systems, and actually where coercion wasn't permitted, and people would have to resolve disputes through processes of deliberation and debate.
David, you write also in the book, just to look at the context of the arguments that you make in this, quite monumental work, 700 pages long, that the book began as an appeal to ask better questions. So, as academics, journalists, activists committed to social justice and greater levels of equality, what are the questions that we should be asking?
Well, as you mentioned, David was deeply involved in the global justice movement. And at least as I perceive it, the central question of that movement is whether our current cultural system, with all of its issues, including issues of sustainability and the climate crisis, whether this is really basically the only way that we can organize our societies today, or whether there are in fact viable alternatives. And as an anthropologist and an archaeologist, it's a very logical thing to do, is then to simply look at all the other ways that humans have in fact organized themselves over the whole span of our species' history. And when you do that in the light of modern scientific evidence, other questions and other possibilities do in fact come to light. For example, questions about sustainable cities. Actually, it turns out that for many centuries or even thousands of years, we have evidence now of really large-scale, densely populated societies which lived in cities that were essentially decentralized in terms of their decision-making processes. We have examples of mass societies which managed to organize themselves without reducing people to numbers in a queue. So they don't have the kind of impersonal bureaucracies that we just sort of take for granted today and feel are kind of inevitable. And we also have some really striking examples, including one from pre-Columbian Central America, from Mexico.
David, we have 5 seconds.
Systems of democracy which were based on the principle of containing one's ego rather than flaunting one's ego.
We're going to have to leave it there, David. I thank you so much for being with us, but people can get it in the book by David Wengrow and the late David Graeber.
Okay, so that moment there at the end was what I was talking about, which I thought was kind of funny. But any initial reactions or thoughts you guys have coming up based on that interview?
But not a like a serious thought, but I just thought it was funny when she said quite monumental work, 700 pages. Like, man, if you couldn't have summarized that a little bit.
Yeah, not like a beneficial thought maybe, but more conspiratorial, where obviously the guy who organized Wall Street and came out with these books dies early. You could kind of write that one, I guess. It's, I don't know. I guess it's just sad that, it's like we're robbed of a brilliant mind. And he seems so chill and down to earth, and, in the actual videos and describing the police system, it's like, yeah.
Yeah. That's tough. Just hard to expect. Life expectancy in general is kind of all over the place, but you have some people like Noam Chomsky who live almost for forever, but then someone like this just dies early. It's tragic.
Yeah. There were a couple things in there that I think I was just trying to think of what's the easy answer for the question, when it came to inequality, and it was just muscle, or who's the stronger, right? How'd that start? One thing that did pop to me was he's talking about the sustainable cities, and it made me think back to the book and what they were talking about, sustainable cities. And maybe we had this conversation, but it was what what would a sustainable city actually look like today? Like if a well thought out plan using all the technology we have today, what would that actually look like? How many people could it support? Could you have a population of 1 billion people in the size of the Adirondack Park and have them all be completely happy and healthy or whatnot, just something like that.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. Like the actual infrastructure needed and the systems in place, and it would be really fun. I think that's the other thing too. It's like it would be the fun, playful, imaginary, mind that we have potentially, lost, I guess.
Yeah. That's why fiction is so important to me, just like reading novels and stuff too. It's like a playground for imagining other ways of being in a lot of ways. And so, especially like science fiction novels. I've mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin before, but her novel, The Dispossessed, is an incredibly good book that does exactly this kind of thing. And it imagines like an anarchist, small scale communist society on a moon. And then on the main planet, there are two main societies. One is a hyper capitalist society, the other one is like a authoritarian, loosely coded Soviet style society. The book was written in the 70s, so Cold War era makes sense. But yeah, just to see the different forms of organization she imagines and what the people's lives are like in each one, it's just a playground for sorting out some of these problems. So yeah, I always love reading novels for that reason, especially.
That one on my shelf for a while and have not gotten to it yet. So I guess I'll have to
The
mark that over the break.
Dispossessed.
Yeah. That
Oh,
one will
dude,
be
it's
over the
good.
break.
Yeah, I love it. The other thing I was thinking about, I think based on the first thing you said, Cody, you were talking about that question about inequality and what was coming up for you was like, I guess whoever's the strongest or
Yeah.
whoever can
Yeah.
exercise the most force. And something that he had mentioned a couple of times in the interview and that they've come back to in the book over and over again is, how do you make organization happen in a society? And part of these forms of domination they've talked about are ways of coercing people into organizing themselves. But the other alternative that he mentioned in the interview, and that is sort of the beginning and the end point for this book, is the example of the Plains Nations and these Great Lakes societies that coercion was almost the biggest crime you could commit against another person within your society. To coerce another person who's considered your equal into doing anything is a huge crime in that society. And so it's a basis of persuasion rather than coercion. And so what does large scale, to your other question, what does large scale organization look like in the modern period? Or what possibilities could that take on the basis of persuasion rather than coercion? That's why I think the history helps too, especially these last two chapters, the full circle chapter going through Cahokia, which maybe is really the first North American state if we're thinking about combining forms of domination. It seems like they had the coercive, they had the monopoly or control on violence down, and they also had this control of information, kind of. So they're basically a state, but then what all these Plains nations did in response to Cahokia, I think, is a kind of historical blueprint or a menu of options for us to consider. In various ways, they all seem to be highly involved on small scale councils and organizations, and they sort of take this flattened organizational principle really seriously and like sort of ritualize it. It's almost like their religion becomes the basis for making sure that everyone is participating and being part of the democratic process in some way. And yeah, I guess it just, for me, sounds like the hard work of imagining an alternative comes down to how do you convince all of your neighbors to meet on a regular basis and to make decisions together about what you want to do with the shared resources you happen to have. That's the process, I feel like, is where it gets started, is those small scale council situations where you just have meetings. Like, what are the politics involved in having a meeting with your community? That's kind of where I want to go.
Yeah, it's hard because it's like, they say that the, lack of imagination and things, maybe leads to this like stagnancy. And it's like also the other side of this is like, you have an anarchist co-writing this book, and like obviously the state is going to shut down any alternative to challenging their power. So it's like, yeah, how can you organize these meetings? How can you actually meaningfully engage in play without the state doing like you brought up like that Family Guy episode, and I remember watching it like when it probably aired, and I think didn't the state just like come in and puff up like Peter Griffin, and it's like you try to do that, they're going to take you out. It's really difficult. There's the power be that wants to have that be up on the pedestal, and it's like, without challenge, and then you want to engage and play again. And how can you actually do that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up. I was watching a bunch of random interviews with David Graeber trying to prepare for this last episode, and he did a couple of interviews on Charlie Rose. And one of those, he was talking about his other book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, that came out in like 2011 or something. In order to prepare for that book, he had done a lot of anthropological research in Madagascar. He'd gone and lived in Madagascar for a while and observed rural communities in Madagascar. And what he had observed is sort of the rural communities kind of existed outside of the state of Madagascar. The sort of infrastructure of the Madagascar state had withdrawn from the rural communities. It wasn't providing services. It really wasn't involved in their lives at all. But what David pointed out in the interview is that they did not make the mistake, these rural communities, of publicly announcing their independence from the state and being like, haha, we're independent from you now, we're our own thing. They just carried on with their lives and organized their communities however they wanted to and just ignored the state. So really Peter Griffin's mistake in that example is being so bombastic about his independence instead of just like carrying on without worrying about the state. So that's what made me think about when you were saying that.
That stories like I feel like I've heard stories like that about places in Russia that like are really anti-Putin and stuff, but like they just the way they deal with it is just by like not engaging and like just there's like this whatever they're doing, we're just gonna ignore that and live our lives another way. Yeah, I wonder, is that a viable economic solution these days? Can we start our own? Yeah.
That's kind of the theory behind mutual aid. I mean, I mentioned it briefly in that one Substack piece I put up for our podcast, but this theory of relativism, of just like building your own infrastructure for taking care of your communities outside of any dependence on the government or on corporations, and just making governments and corporations increasingly irrelevant to the sustainability of your own lives and your own communities. Really what we're talking about is how to start building up that alternative infrastructure within our own communities in a democratic way that doesn't reproduce coercion or hierarchy or things like that. Anyway, I just want to kind of open it up to you guys now, like on all this whole journey with our book, with everything we've gone through over the last several weeks. What kind of questions or problems? They ended the interview with David just now about the authors of the book say that we need better questions to ask about history, about humanity or whatever. What questions are lingering for you guys as we wrap up this journey?
I think like the big question for me is like, how do you change the incentive structure? Like, how do you go from a profit motive incentive structure that is all dominating to one that is more focused on the population as a whole or the well-being of people as a whole? Because as long as that's there, or at least some form of that's there, or maybe like it's just not like balanced, right? I guess that's the thing that I continue to struggle with. Like, I just don't see how, when all the power is focused in that you could even unentrench it without it fucking up considerably on its own first, right? Like, if everything's going smoothly, if it's doing everything it's supposed to be doing, then enough people wouldn't be having a conversation about like, is the system working or not, right? So like, it almost needs to break itself. Like, it's kind of where my head goes, but I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of feeling like they happen simultaneously. Like, I mean, on the one hand, the system is kind of eating itself before our eyes. Like, we're watching all these infrastructures fall and fail and disappoint people over and over again. And it's kind of a matter of like, people are going to figure out other ways to organize their communities in the absence of some system they no longer trust. The more that trust in the system degrades, the more people will look to their own alternatives. And I guess there's probably going to be some kind of landscape of many different options, the same way we've looked at in history of like all the various ways people have decided to organize themselves. I mean, you have hippie communes and you have biker gangs, and those are both choices that communities make on their own. And so, yeah, maybe it's not a matter of answering that in a definitive singular way. Like, there has to be one way, one alternative, but what is the field of playful alternatives? What does that whole field look like? And where do we as individuals naturally want to fit into that. What kinds of alternatives appeal to you personally? What kinds of, if you could organize your community, what are some things you would suggest for new ritualized ways of appreciating some kind of collective identity?
I like that. Mine kind of gets into something similar where I guess we're so politically creative for like 40,000 years. And I guess my mind just kept going to this specific transformation that allowed capitalism to destroy all the alternatives. And I kind of went into a um, fiction. I was just fictitiously picturing this group that actually did create these exact things and actually led to, and I guess my question was more about that specific instance. And I want to know, and I think there's a lot of examples of big picture how society can lead to this kind of thing. And there are systems in place and you can kind of read philosophy getting into these things, but I just wanted to know the specific group and the actual, I don't know, I have this conspiratorial echelon of this group meeting and discussing the, exactly what ideological and violence and charismatic forces are needed to control people and how they're going to do this in a world system basis. So I don't know. I just thought more yeah.
Are you talking about the Illuminati? Is that?
I am, but I didn't want to say it. Come on, though. There's classes, of course, of people and systems that obviously want to keep it in check. And
So that's a really interesting thought experiment. Just, I don't know. I've always struggled with that just because having worked on some things that people think are conspiracy stuff and seeing the inside of it, you're just it's way more boring than that.
Totally.
For a ton of that stuff, it's got to be 90% of it. But at the same time, I wonder if it comes back to just I don't know, we talked about it in a bunch of different episodes about how systems grow and institutions grow and they take on identities. And so once you have all these people that have reached a point to where they play a pivotal role in this system, whether they believed going into it that they were going to dominate the world with this or help it go that way or not, right? They've just been molded by that institution to become exactly what you're talking about, Arthur, right?
Totally.
Is that how that works? I guess I don't know. I mean, there's probably a bit of both, honestly. I could totally see Elon Musk at the head of a table somewhere for sure.
Yeah, but
He's at the side on those tables. He's not at the head. That's just for the TV.
I guess it's just capitalism specifically with wage labor and debt. And I think it's Graeber who has the earlier book too, Bullshit Jobs, who talks about how maybe 50% of the jobs, how you tie them to self-worth, they're actually kind of pointless and meaningless and state violence. So all these things within capitalism specifically, I guess, that lead to this anti-imaginative world and you can't experiment and play anymore. And I think, it's likely what you're saying where people get into these power structures and they kind of propagate that thing itself. And I guess that's how systems get built. And bureaucracy, yeah.
But I don't know. Then I'm thinking the flip side of that is the Epstein, all his weird connections, and it's
oh, totally.
Maybe that table's got to exist a little bit.
Yeah,
Peter Thiel.
Yeah, I think to your point, Arthur, about the conspiracy or whatever, capitalism is a specific kind of way of organizing society, and it's an ingenious method of coercion on a mass scale. You get people dependent to a system of money whereby they have to find some wage labor job in order to have the certain kind of paper that's valid at places where they distribute your basic needs. You kind of have to participate in the system to survive. It's a global form of coercion for getting people stuck. There are obviously a small group of elites that are interested in maintaining their power over that system. And of course, they're going to conspire together in various ways. And not all of this is even secret. There are groups like the IMF and the World Bank that are that are literally the public infrastructure of this exactly kind of club of people who want to control the global capitalist system. And so for us on the other side of that equation, just thinking broadly about the working class, the masses of people who are stuck in this system and trying to imagine alternative ways of being, it comes down to having to step up our organization game. Like, we have to organize ourselves just as aggressively, if not more so, than they are organizing themselves, right? And so again, it comes back to these small communal ways of meeting together, making decisions together, making our sustainable communities not dependent on systems of capital and government and so forth. So that small scale question of organization is always central to it, and why mutual aid is so important, and why the Black Panthers tried to start the school lunch program, and then the government said, no, we can't have them feeding children for lunch. We're going to step in. And now there's a federally mandated kind of school lunch program in response to communities trying to organize out of that. So there's that back and forth struggle. But yeah, that's kind of how I break down that issue.
Sorry, the thought I have is not directly connected to that. I mean, it kind of is, but I feel like you're talking mutual aid as the solution for a lot of these things, and I'm thinking this gets us in trouble. How do we diagnose the mental issue that the people have in the tribe or in society that makes them want to just dominate everybody else in the first place? And like, what role do they really need to be playing in society versus just constantly being the fucking wolf that's trying to, take everything they can from everybody else? I mean, like, we think small scale, right? Really small scale, like in a tribe or something like that. That person gets kicked out or like fucking murked probably, right? Like if he's being like trying to take over, like for a lot of the indigenous tribes, if they're trying to impose their will on other people, right? Like we can't talk about that anymore, right? That's not a viable solution as I mean, because that's essentially what there's a person supposedly on trial for, right, in New York City right now. So I don't know if that's a helpful segue or not.
No, it's definitely a problem that's worth thinking about. Like, on a small scale, you're going to have charismatic people with ulterior motives who want to try to create some sort of hierarchy for themselves. I think with a lot of things that we typically think of as bad behavior among average people that make us think that there's perhaps a more widespread tendency for human beings in general to be nasty or be competitive. I think part of that is propaganda, in the sense that we're in indoctrinated from a young age to be competitive with one another rather than collaborative. Even just thinking about grades in the classroom, of trying to be the student with the highest grade or whatever, that gets incentivized way more than collaborating with your peers gets incentivized over the course of K through 12 typical education. So just even that in and of itself sort of tips the scales in favor of a competitive psychology. But beyond all that, when people's basic needs are taken care of, when no one is stressed out worrying about whether or not they have a safe place to sleep, whether or not they have healthy, enjoyable food to eat, whether or not they have clothes on their back, when all those needs are taken care of, I have a belief, and maybe this is naive, but I have a belief that humans in general are pretty kind to one another when you have that baseline structure in place where everyone's basic needs are taken care of. You have a lot less of that nasty, competitive one-upsmanship going on. And maybe that's just a naive belief I have, but that's the way I choose to look at human beings.
The only thing I was thinking there was like, I just kind of fantasized about if we had the replicators from Star Trek like tomorrow, like what would day one look like versus day 1000? Day one would be insane. Like, because everyone would still have that. I got to stock up, man. Like, I'm going to get like 20 Rolexes. But like day 1000, it's be like, oh man, like let's throw that back in the atomizer so that it can get reused.
There's an episode about that on Lower Decks. They go to a post-scarcity society that basically exactly the scenario you just described. They got the replicator technology, and the Cerritos has to go to that planet to sort of manage the mayhem that's going on, because everybody's just having orgies and celebrating and doing drugs and just like having a great time, and it's just chaotic, but also festive and enjoyable. But yeah, exactly that certain scenario.
It like leads to hedonism. The thing I thought immediately was like, what's the subscription model day one versus day 1000? We got to increase the subscription model.
Had to go there.
Yeah, one of the interviews I watched, Charlie Rose had asked David Graeber about his opinions on capitalism or whatever and what it is. And he was talking about capitalism as like the need for growth as being kind of a central tenet, is that there's an expectancy that there will be a sustainable rate of growth in perpetuity. And he pointed out like a simple problem with that is there's not enough metal in the crust of the earth for everyone in China to have a car. Charlie Rose was like, well, make them out of plastic then. And he was like, that's a petroleum product. I don't know what you mean. Like,
oh, man, we're going to mine it. We're going to grab asteroids from space. That's the next frontier. That's how the expanse happens. But I'm guessing no proto-molecule.
Any quotes or standout moments for you guys in these final two chapters? And Full Circle, which is kind of one of their standard chapters in terms of making big arguments and also providing a lot of specific examples of research, or the last shorter chapter that's more of an overview of their argument. Any standout moments you want to point us at?
Yeah, I got one of each, and the first one I had was on page 446, which is after they kind of were discussing Scott, who talks about how you get into these like agricultural traps where agriculture maybe leads to more likelihood of getting like taxed and going to war and more bureaucracy because you're going after grain and the crops. Or anyway, the quote on 446, until around a half millennium ago, a large proportion of the world's population still lived either beyond the tax collector's purview or within reach of some relatively straightforward means of escaping it. Yet today, in our 21st century world, this is obviously no longer the case. Something did go terribly wrong, at least from the point of view of the barbarians. We no longer live in that world, but merely recognizing that it existed for so long allows us to pose a further important question. How inevitable, really, were the type of governments we have today, with their particular fusion of territorial sovereignty, intense administration, and competitive politics? Was this really the necessary culmination of human history? I loved it. I just thought it exemplified the questions that they pose and kind of go into, they've done like maybe 10 to 12 examples of exactly why, breaking down, it wasn't inevitable, this hierarchy. And so I just loved this and kind of thought that it summarized it really well.
Yeah, I mean, I underlined those questions too at the end of that paragraph. The whole question of taxation, on the one hand, it's weird to have this conversation because I kind of politically came of age when libertarianism was kind of all the rage in a lot of people in my age group. And I do want to do a little schismogenesis and not lump myself in with like the Milton Friedman types or whatever. But taxation as a sort of non-consensual form of debt that everyone is born into. No one consents to being taxed. No one asks your permission. Do you want to be taxed? Do you want to opt out of this system? Oh, you're in it. Sorry. And no means of escaping that debt that just carries on for the rest of your life because you live under the governance of a nation state. That's a kind of trap that's really important to think about because we don't have truly democratic means of controlling how that money is spent. Therefore, most of it gets spent on war and violence, and you have a military budget that's $1 trillion right now. As a form of debt, I just think tax is an interesting thing to think about.
I've always thought about the democracy around tax too, and like how come you can't vote for 10% of my tax goes to the public schools, and maybe you want, because I think if people could elect where their taxes go, you'd actually get a pretty good representation of like, there would be those militarized people who want to, do that. But like my money, I don't want to give it there. I want to give it somewhere else. And how come I can't choose to do that? But I can choose to like vote between two parties. It's that should definitely be a campaign and a law. And I remember Obama, his first thing in Senate was like to do a website where you could see where your taxes go. But like, that's as far as they let that happen. They didn't push the boundary at all on you choosing a tax, even a percentage, 1%.
I actually had a section later on in that chapter that I really loved. One, because it was talking about upstate New York. Shout out to upstate New York. This is just the last, I think, second to last page of the chapter, 491. I'm just going to read the second paragraph in here to give context to the paragraph before. It's basically talking about how the French that were occupying this area had tolerated the Five Nations, or had some tolerable relations with the Five Nations previously. And then this one that came and decided like he wanted to take them all out. So he came up with this ingenious plan to lure all of their like leaders and chieftains to one location, took like 200 of them captive as galley slaves and was going to ship them off. That enters this, I can't remember if this is her name and I'm going to say it wrong, but it's like Jiga Hosanahan, or it's the second paragraph on page 491. If that's like her title, with this Indigenous person. She had, however, chosen not to attend Donovan's meeting. The arrest of the entire Grand Council left her the highest-ranking League official. Since in such an emergency there was no time to raise new chiefs, she and the remaining clan mothers themselves raised an army. Many of those recruited, it is reported, were themselves Seneca women. As it turned out, the Jigasan, yeah, I'm gonna have to like figure that out after and like redub that in. But anyway, I listened to it this morning. It was a far superior military tactician to Danville. After routing the invading French troops near Victor, New York, her forces were at the point of entering Montreal when the French government sued for peace, agreeing to dismantle Fort Niagara and returning the surviving galley slaves. When Lahontan later notes that, like Candia Rock, those who had been galley slaves in France were highly critical of French institutions, he is referring largely to those taken prisoner on this occasion, or more specifically, the dozen or so out of the original 200 that made it back alive. So like that whole story right there was kind of incredible to me, especially the way that it made up the French commander that was coming in. He was like competent military commander and was going to come and rout these tribes or whatever. And then she raised an army and beat them back all the way to Montreal. So I thought that was a really awesome story.
Yeah, I love that story too. I appreciate you doing summary of all the background and stuff too, because the whole context is really fascinating, just like as a historical event. And I was thinking about you when I read that section too, just thinking about the issue you had posed in our last episode about in-group, out-group violence and the temporary need to organize people in order to defend themselves. I thought her example was a great option for exactly the problem you were thinking about, what she was able to do to persuade people in this moment of great need to voluntarily come and defend their group. And then after the threat is dissolved, that kind of militaristic organization naturally dissolves as well, just as one example of the problem you were talking about last time.
I think that also answers your question to me originally, because I think you said, like, what are the forms of domination you need to be able to, like, and I think I said, well, to do it effectively, and I still stand by that, you need all three. But really all you need is a really inspirational leader to rally the troops, right? Like, and then, yeah, go from there.
Combine charisma with some strong persuasion in a moment of need, and a volunteer force assembles itself. I think if you can avoid coercion, I just think that's a good basic principle for just imagining alternative forms of government, of just trying to do it without any form of coercion. I think I just really like that approach, and I thought that was a good example of that kind of thing.
It reminds me of just the discussion of it. I know that in the democracy episode, we talked about like the origins of rhetoric, and there's some famous general who does make like this rhetoric kind of speech over somebody's death and argues to go to war. And it is exactly that. It's like charisma plus, a moment of need for that urgency. And it does lead exactly to that.
Also, insisting on persuasion and making an effort to avoid coercion, it forces people to really think about how to convey their ideas. Like, if you really want to do things your way, you have to put a lot of effort into explaining the so what of your way, of really convincing people that your way you want to do it is worth doing it. And I think that just produces good conversations and good thinkers. They talk about Candia Rock as a figure who was a very intelligent, persuasive, intellectual person because the culture he was reared in insisted on it. In order to be any kind of leader in their society, you had to be persuasive. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking about charisma and persuasion as ways forward. But when you're able to just kind of insist on violence or some sort of leverage you have over someone to shut down their ideas and say, oh, no one cares. We're just going to do it our way. I don't care if you agree with me. We're just going to do it. You're bypassing that whole conversation. You're not giving those ideas a chance to really be expressed and understood and pulled apart. I think that's the environment where propaganda thrives. That's why we have so much propaganda, is because we don't value those rhetorical tools that we're talking about here. But I think that's why I love the podcast too, because we get to do this. We get to unpack all these ideas together and really break it down and wrestle with it together. It feels collaborative, right? It feels a lot better than having some kind of shitty argument with people on Facebook or something.
Trying to just get the clicks, man. Gotta get the clicks.
On page 502, and I would say that, like, one of my favorite chapters throughout the book was chapter 6, the Garden of Adonis. I really loved I guess like growing up in and going through education in like a philosophy mind frame, they teach you about Hobbes and Rousseau and these justifications towards hierarchy, and you're taught to kind of like critique them of your own volition, But I graduated in 2015, and this book came out in like 2020, so I didn't get this kind of insight around the hierarchy argument. And Enlightenment thinkers like they really misframed the freedom, and even in that Democracy Now! Interview, they talk about how it was more like Europe kind of took the indigenous critique of Europe and then reframed everything as though it was freedom. But anyway, they say on 502, in this kind of context of this misframing of the inevitability of hierarchy, if something at the, sorry, that's the third paragraph here. If something did go terribly wrong in human history, and given the current state of the world, it's hard to deny something did, then perhaps it began to go wrong precisely when people started losing that freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence, to such a degree that some now feel this particular type of freedom hardly even existed, or was barely exercised, for the greater part of human history. Even those few anthropologists, such as Pierre Clastres and later Christopher Bohm, who argued that humans were always able to imagine alternative social possibilities, conclude, rather oddly, that for roughly 95% of our species' history, those same humans recoiled in horror from all possible social worlds but one, the small-scale society of equals. Our only dreams were nightmares, terrible visions of hierarchy, domination, and the state. In fact, as we've seen, this is clearly not the case. And then they go into it. But I loved that, they really talk about how, like, this is not what people wanted. They wanted small scale. And again, I guess it gets to the point of, like, how did it get to this and going into statehood and all that.
And the things you just said there, Arthur, was the reframed everything is freedom. I think, how they took like what was actual freedom and like reframed the European ideals as like, this is what's giving you freedom. And it was just like reminding me so much of a lot of the rhetoric of today, like, trying to like take, the essentially like, ICE coming in and just being able to grab people off the street regardless of like what your status is, whatever. Like that's more freedom like coming to you, right? Like, and the reframing of things like that, or taking away people's rights as individual freedoms, like, yeah, never stopped, just kept rolling.
Yeah. There's like a cage of like, the state obviously is a cage itself. And then they're putting forth this idea of like we ourselves are now in a cage because the imagination and the limitation like is a cage itself. So there's like a cage in us, there's a cage of the state. Maybe the state is perpetuating that cage. And it's like, we got to free ourselves from the internal and the external.
Cage is all the way down.
Yeah. But it goes into a lot of like what we talk about, which is, these internalized givens that we're like born into. And like maybe we got to question those sexuality and masculinity, all the normativities that we have. And so it's like freeing yourself from that allows you to free yourself in the imagination. And then you got to tackle the state.
Yeah, that moment you pointed out, Arthur, I highlighted a few things from these few pages from like 501, 502, and 503. And they're talking about these, well, I guess what I want to bring it to is this idea of ritual and this idea of play. And they talk about rituals of play as like encyclopedias of social possibilities, that encoded within the rituals themselves were like a record of the different alternative options of forming a society. And so just as an experimental kind of question for us to play with for a minute, if we had to imagine ourselves forming a new society or whatever, thinking about what kinds of rituals we want to enact, there are three freedoms. And I think it's important to like define their three freedoms, because freedom in general is kind of vague and murky. But when we say the freedom to move around, or how they phrase it on 503, the freedom to move away or relocate from one's surroundings, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands issued by others, and the freedom to shape entirely new social realities or shift back and forth between different ones. What kind of rituals of play would you like to imagine that allow us to remember these three freedoms? Maybe that's too abstract or weird of a question, but how can we keep these three freedoms in mind when we're imagining the new world?
So I'm not sure if I'm thinking of this right, but I'm almost, are you meaning like how can we keep doing this? Like, would things like Renfest or like what's another one? Like I was saying, like the Electric Light, like EDM concert, like like festivals. Like I guess like
Yeah.
is that kind of what you're talking about? Like things that we do now as kind of like experimental things that we can still do to play and see like what could a society look like? I mean, if maybe there was a Renaissance festival where when you showed up, like there's no money, you can bring in like you can trade, you can like do I don't know, like maybe here's some like wooden toggles or something, right? And like go figure something out. Hopefully you have a skill. Like a festival like that for like a week. Or are you talking more of like permanent structure? Like how do we move to that?
I guess I'm talking about really anything, but it's really about making up new games or rituals for us to play with. And Renfest is one example. You could take something that already exists and try to imagine ways to adapt it. But yeah, a temporary society that you play with. Everyone goes voluntarily to play with this imagined society. But what kinds of games will we need to come up with in order to remember and honor the freedom to move around on the one hand, or the freedom to disobey others on the other hand, or the freedom to form new social groups on a third hand? I'm messing up the metaphor now, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess my mind originally went to Graeber talking about the police force and, one season you're in it, one season you're not. So I think like seasonal gatherings, maybe twice, 3 times, 4 times a year, whatever, where people reaffirm or like change up their role and job, it would be really interesting. Like, right now I'm thinking we just had this sinkhole appear on like, a street here in Eugene, and like, yeah, the experts can do it. They're eWeb, that's our local board, but it's like, what if they only did that for 2 years? They got the expertise and then they went and they found something like, you have this whole human who's can do anything. That would be awesome. And I think like traveling, yeah, you have to have this maybe like shared resource zones between travel points. So homelessness isn't a thing. And you can go from Portland to Seattle and there's 4 stops in between with all the food and all the whatever. And ritualizing that like open door policy somehow where you welcome others in and you allow others to leave would be really cool. I like the idea of like a Ren fair or a EDM like festival, like being like more like, yeah, travel points. Like, how come there isn't a Ren society every spring 200 miles away? And we all, if you want to go, you go, and they don't have money. And there's, so I think like having those kind of things would be cool. And maybe not like private property. Can we like normalize? I don't know. That's a really hard one, I think, for people. But like, maybe
Yeah.
I don't live in this house every year, Is there a game there?
Is there like a collective of communes spread throughout
Yeah.
the United States, just in all the cool cities, right? Like, or at least just outside of them, right? Where you could be like, well, they need somebody that knows how to do X in Denver for the next 10 months. Yeah, let's go do that. This is sounding
That's
like
cool.
either, what's that?
That's that's just really cool how you're like, oh, somebody in Denver needs this. And that's what they did, remember, with the Lane Society it's really hard to remember the Latin American societies,
Yeah.
all of them. But that's like, hiring an outside expert to come in and be your ruler would be really cool.
Hey, they did a good job down there. This is almost turning into, what was it, Roadhouse? Like, you just got to get Patrick Swayze to come into your town and, like, kick the shit out of the bad guys for a little bit, and then it's cool, then he'll move on to the next town.
Yeah, but everything you were saying, Arthur, is like exactly describing how they explain how the freedom to move worked in indigenous cultures. Is like the reason there was a largely understood freedom for anyone to move anywhere at any time they wanted to is because it was mutually understood that hospitality was a given. No matter where you went in North America, it seemed like there were people who would welcome you as an outsider and make sure that you weren't going hungry or sleeping out in the cold or whatever, that hospitality was just part of the general zeitgeist of the time. Which sounds great. But yeah, just thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking about the Appalachian Trail. I know Cheyenne walked that, right? And
Yeah.
and they have kind of like a system of hospitality
Totally.
that's voluntarily set up along that route.
It's a great model, I think. That's really cool. The other one I was thinking is like, the Thomas Jefferson rewrite the Constitution. Let's play a game where every 5 years we rewrite it. Let's just see what happens.
I was thinking too there about like, I know maybe I've mentioned before of holding elections, having a lottery system, the same way jury duty works, basically, for elected officials, and like an ongoing short-term limit. Maybe you get a year or two to try to do some legislation, but that's it. None of these lifetime people or whatever. Understanding that it's rotational, that it could be your turn to do it at any moment. Understanding that anyone you have a beef with could end up being your legislator the next year. Sort of the same framework that David Graeber was talking about in that interview clip with the police state, with the police officers rotating seasonally, just as a different model of governance of like, okay, we're not going to elect anybody. It's everybody's job to know how to govern on a basic level, and that's taught at an early age. I think teaching kids how to hold meetings just as a skill, how to organize yourselves and have a meeting, and like teaching them different ways to do that could be an incredibly transformative thing education-wise. But if they have that basic skill, they know how to be a participatory member of a meeting. That's a basic skill needed for governance, for being a legislator, and understanding that you could get called to do that at any time. What would society look like if it was mutually understood that anyone could be called at any time to go serve on the U.S. House or serve on the Senate? They'd get a short term and then they'd be back in the community a short time later. Like, what would that society look like?
I think that's a huge point. Is like they'd be back in the society. They're not like escape into Martha's Vineyard in an $8 million mansion at the end of their term, or becoming a lobbyist. They're actually back in a community, which means that you have to have some sort of like responsibility because otherwise you're getting eaten alive. So, yeah, that would be sweet. It's like Secret Santa, but for president.
I think if you did something like that, there's no more of this norms bullshit, though. I think we've seen how much political norms have held society together for however long now. And if you just have one person that's just willing to not give a shit about norms whatsoever, they can just bowl through all of that. Like, no norms, like, like, or like whatever the norms are. If you have to have a bunch of people round a dude up again with clubs and beat the crap out of him, that gets you into a whole nother mob justice scenario. That's probably not good. There was a quote here, though, that I can't remember exactly where this was because I was listening to chapter 12, but I think the quote was, "Play kings cease to be play kings when they start killing people." And I was like, damn, like, yeah, like, given our episode that we had this week of all the people that are non-play king, I guess, is doing just murdering people. Like, I was like, wow, that one hit pretty good. But then the other piece, oh no, actually, maybe we kind of talked about this a little bit with just the Renaissance Festival piece, but just it was describing some of the wars in there. Like, yeah, there were some that were obviously big battles, and then there were some that were more likely like a couple warriors were like swinging swords at each other, maybe tossing a javelin and then walking away. And that also made me think of like Renaissance Festival and like these maybe like, spectacles that they're putting on between two towns, almost more of like a, sporting event, kind of like the same thing that we do, like what, replica they're going to find of like kids soccer balls, like, oh, this, like, or some weird stuff like that between villages. But anyway, those are kind of like the last two things I had from 12 there.
Yeah, no, that's a big point too, because like so many of these societies we've looked at in the book have, especially Latin American societies, or Central American, I should say, have these examples of warfare / sports, like they're games that double for some kind of competition with another society. And I think about that all the time when, if I see the NFL, if I see their whole propaganda machine or how they frame everything, like, it's obviously war coded. Like the whole infrastructure of the sports system is a kind of cultural code for warfare, is one way of looking at it. But it's an interesting part of culture to look at, no matter which culture you look at. There's something about violence you can read into the way they handle sports. But I think the other thing that I was thinking about with what you were saying was the scale. You were sort of indicating how a long time ago, and what came to my mind was the movie Troy, starring Brad Pitt, and how you have these random moments where the heroes are sort of doing their battle with each other and all the other warriors are just standing around holding the circle, watching them do their thing, and how different that is from like large-scale bureaucratic warfare that we see today with like F-16s and, huge
Drones.
artillery systems and all sorts of, like, the infrastructure of violence just scales up in a really grotesque way. And something's going wrong there bureaucratically. right, that we're letting happen. I guess the only moment that I'd flagged that we haven't gotten to really kind of has to do with technology. And I felt like maybe there's something worth talking about here. Maybe it's a bit of a dud, but I feel like there's something interesting here relating to the scale of technology and what we think about with modern narratives with the sweep of history and how we think our society we have now is different in part because we have such great technological advancements. Like, yeah, human beings have done a bunch of different things throughout the last 40,000 years or so, but now we have the internet, and that's fundamentally different in a major way. And so just thinking about technology and perspective, this moment's like 499 mainly, carries over onto 500 and 501 a little bit, but it's talking about the bigger scale of technological changes and these breakthrough moments we tend to think about. I'll try to read quickly because I want to read most of 499 and then just pose a question or give you or pose their question about gender at the end of this. So they say at the first full paragraph of 499, now we are hardly about to deny that technologies play an important role in shaping society. Obviously, technologies are important. Each new invention opens up social possibilities that had not existed before. At the same time, it's very easy to overstate the importance of new technologies in setting the overall direction of social change. To take an obvious example, the fact that Teotihuacanos or Tlaxcalteca employed stone tools to build and maintain their cities while the inhabitants of Mohenjo-Daro or Knossos used metal seems to have made surprisingly little difference to those cities' internal organization or even size. Nor does our evidence support the notion that major innovations always occur in sudden revolutionary bursts, transforming everything in their wake. This, as you'll recall, is one of the main points to emerge from the 2 chapters we devoted to the origins of farming. Nobody, of course, claims that the beginnings of agriculture were anything quite like, say, the invention of the steam-powered loom or the electric light bulb. We can be fairly certain there was no Neolithic equivalent of Edmund Cartwright or Thomas Edison, who came up with the conceptual breakthrough that set everything in motion. Still, it often seems difficult for contemporary writers to resist the idea that some sort of similarly dramatic break with the past must have occurred. In fact, as we've seen, what actually took place was nothing like that. Instead of some male genius realizing his solitary vision, innovation in Neolithic societies was based on a collective body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, largely by women, in an endless series of apparently humble but in fact enormously significant discoveries. Many of those Neolithic discoveries had the cumulative effect of reshaping everyday life every bit as profoundly as the automatic loom or light bulb. Every time we sit down to breakfast, we are likely to be benefiting from a dozen such prehistoric inventions. Who was the first person to figure out that you could make bread rise by the addition of those microorganisms we call yeasts? We have no idea, but we can be almost certain she was a woman and would most likely not be considered white if she tried to immigrate to a European country today. And we definitely know her achievement continues to enrich the lives of billions of people. So I'm skipping all the rest of that on 500 and jumping over to the top of 501 just to pose this question they have. If we are trying to frame more interesting questions to ask of history, this might be one. Is there a positive correlation between what is usually called gender equality, which might better be termed simply women's freedom, and the degree of innovation in a given society?
I mean, I don't see why there wouldn't be. You're basically cutting off 50% of your population if you're just like repressing them and saying, "Hey, get back in the kitchen. No more thinking for you. That's not what your job is." And then, I mean, with 50% of the population getting told that, the other 50% is probably pretty arrogant and coming up with some shitty ideas.
Yeah, it just seems like a lot of these basic skills that we benefit from, like, I mean, a lot of it has to do with food too, especially different ways to cook and store things, which just simple experiments that people do and they figure things out. And some woman way back when just didn't think it was a big deal, but passed that knowledge on into her family and her friends, and that carried on. And now we all benefit from like bread and wine and the magic of fermentation in general because some women experimented with it way back when.
Yeah, they talk about it too, like in that Garden of Adonis chapter, where it's like maybe it started as playing with rituals and planting and seeds and all of these experimentations with fire and things like that. And like that's so much more important than a steam engine. Like, yeah, we're alive because of yeast and bread and, beer and wine and things. So it's pretty interesting. I think definitely a correlation between freedom and innovation, of course, and in regards to specifically around women or marginalized groups. How come they've made all these advances and they just get completely occluded? And what actually comes to rise is like a white guy invented something that has to do with electricity or power, and like, let's, canonize that. How come we don't know the first person who made turd yeast? That's crazy.
There's also just kind of codes, not universally. This is obviously a loose analysis or whatever, but in the frame of what we've been saying, it's also competitive versus collaborative. If it's a competitive culture, you want to stamp your name on it. You want to claim it. You want to mark it as a great, respectable invention. If it's a collaboratively incentivized culture, then you don't really care if you're the one that came up with it. You just get to enjoy the benefit of it and share it with everybody else. And so that's another way of looking at some of these specifically matriarchal type of ancient civilizations we've looked at as collaboratively incentivized cultures versus some of the more heroic kingdoms or our modern capitalist system as a competitively incentivized culture.
I think like book really highlighted how important play and experimentation really is in a society. The systems of capitalism within wage labor and within institutions of bureaucracy and with charismatic leaders, they really chain and limit us significantly. They curtail any sort of experimentation because once they have found a revenue stream, they protect that revenue stream and you cannot compete with it. You can't actually enter into it. They make the barrier of entry more difficult. And it's the same for politics. And it's why we have a bicameral system and we don't actually experiment at all with third-party candidates unless a populist candidate rises to some degree. But I really loved all of the examples. It was like such a rich and deep book. I can't even imagine that it was going to be a pamphlet. That is just unbelievable. And really glad that they wrote it. It makes me just want to read more of Graeber's books. And I think adding one would be really good for even next season.
I guess for me, I don't know. Like I think I'm still stuck on the big question of is it people or is it structures, right? Like I don't know that I'm 100% like I know for sure, I mean it's some combination of a percentage of people and their ability to manipulate structures, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I did really like the book. What I appreciated the most about it was definitely the scale that it showed. And it makes me think like the whole question of like, are we stuck? And it's like, are we really stuck or are we just a kind of like a speed bump? And like, in 200 years, like the question of are we stuck is going to seem very silly, right? Like, no, wait, man, they were changing super fast, like who knows, right? They're talking about that one civilization that went from like 300 years of hierarchy to flipping on a dime to like going egalitarian for another 300 years and then like disappearing. So who knows in the like grand scheme of things, but yeah, I guess that's kind of my big takeaway. I really did appreciate the scale, and it, even if we feel like we're in a entrenched situation right now, I guess that makes me think like maybe it's not as entrenched as it really feels at the moment, right? It just needs enough of a push one way or another to show that something else is possible. So
yeah. I really liked what you'd said about people versus structures as a kind of lingering thought you're having about it. I don't know if you guys looked at the footnotes or the endnotes throughout the book. They have like, those books are already, 600 pages that you have to read in the main text, plus 100 pages of endnotes or whatever. But I'd like to flip through the endnotes while I'm reading because some of them are not just bibliographic references. Sometimes it's a long paragraph where they explain a finer detail or whatever. But on page 595, on endnote number 95, which is from the chapter on why the state has no origin, they were talking about how the pyramids were built and how they had organized all these people to build the pyramids. And this note on page 595 talks about Lewis Mumford, a scholar who had imagined the mega machine and argued that the first complex machines were in fact made of people. Made me think about what you were saying about people versus structures and how whatever system of organization we're living in, whatever culture you're in, that system, however you imagine it, is made of people, or first and foremost, their labor, their activity, their organization. And so if you want to change it, I want to come back to this idea of persuasion. It's about persuading the people who make up that machine to do something different, to stop building pyramids and start social housing projects like they did at Teotihuacan, for example. But yeah, that's kind of what it is, understanding that the structures themselves are made of people, and it's about having conversations with those people. Speaking of conversations with people, these have been invaluable and amazing conversations with you guys over the long journey with this book. It is quite a tome. Appreciate y'all putting up with that choice. I will make sure to choose a shorter book next time, just to balance it out. But yeah, really enjoyed these conversations with you guys.
Thanks for picking it. It's such a great read that you can almost go through like any conversation at a holiday with family and touch on you could argue anything. And that's what's so cool. Like the knowledge is so varied and relevant to today that if you read the book and you get the examples and you have that in your brain, it's just going to really help guide any narratives that you find in the world and any propaganda and stuff. So I thought it was a really great book to pick for all those reasons.
Awesome. I totally agree. I'm glad you guys have enjoyed it. I appreciate the listeners for keeping up with us through this book club. Cody, what can we look forward to for season 2's book club to kick us off?
Yeah, kicking us off for season 2, we are going to read Minority Rule by Ari Berman. It's the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. So we're going quite a bit closer to our current date and time. Then we won't be going that far back compared to the book that we just came from. But I'll just read the inner cover here really quick to give you guys an idea. A riveting account of the decades-long effort by reactionary white conservatives to undermine democracy and entrench their power and the movement to stop them. The mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021 represented an extreme form of the central danger facing American democracy today, a blatant disregard for the will of the majority. But this crisis didn't begin or end with Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election. Through voter suppression, election subversion, gerrymandering, dark money, and takeover of the courts, and the whitewashing of history, reactionary white conservatives have strategically entrenched power in the face of massive demographic and political shifts. Ari Berman charts these efforts with sweeping historical research and incisive on-the-ground reporting chronicling how a wide range of anti-democratic tactics interact with profound structural inequalities in institutions like the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court to threaten the survival of representative government in America. The will of the people, wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1801, is the only legitimate foundation of any government. But that foundation is crumbling. Some counter-majoritarian measures were deliberately built into the Constitution, which was designed in part to benefit a small, proprietary white upper class. But they have metastasized to a degree that the founders of the United States could never have anticipated, undermining the very notion of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Chilling and revelatory, Minority Rule exposes a long history of conflict between white supremacy and multiracial democracy that has reached a fever pitch today, while also telling an inspiring story of resistance to these regressive efforts. So that is the book we're going to read. I've listened to it once before, but it's been a minute, and that was obviously before Donald Trump was elected for the second time that this one came out. So that's what we got.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Thanks for listening. That'll do it for us. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.